So master of terror and suspense John Carpenter finally blended together the elements of westerns and horror in this 1998 film that deserves a little bit of a reappraisal after all these years. So let's sink deeply into John Carpenter's Vampires. In the New Mexico desert, master of vampire slayer Jack Crow and his team cleared out a nest of bloodsuckers in a run-down house. But while there are plenty of goons, there's no master to be found. As the team celebrates at the Sun God Motel, Crow contemplates the puzzling absence of the master vampire, but soon his attention turns to the alluring prostitute Katrina, who entices him away. However, when the master vampire Valak finally arrives, he bites Katrina to turn her into one of his own, and soon decimates Jack's entire team in an absolute massacre. Crow and his sole team survivor Montoya set out in pursuit while abducting Katrina. As she gradually turns from human to vampire, she is the sole psychic link to Valak, which they use to track down the leader of the undead. However, unbeknownst to Crow, in stopping Katrina from jumping to her death, Montoya was bitten by her and will eventually be turned into a vampire himself. Once Jack visits with Cardinal Alba and meets the young Father Adam, he learns that Valak is the original vampire, created in an inverse exorcism centuries ago by the Catholic Church. Soon after joining the team, Father Adam is eventually coerced into revealing why Valak attacked and kidnapped a priest in a nearby small town. Valak requires the Bergier cross, which was missing for many long years, in order to complete his transformation, so that he may walk in the daylight, becoming nearly unstoppable. Teamed with Montoya, they induct Adam into the Slayers and attempt to draw out Valak's band of master vampires with the help of Katrina's visions. However, as the hour draws late, they run out of daylight and are faced with a terrifying reality that they may all die. Time to see Valak become a vampire, unkillable by the light of day. So John Carpenter's Vampires, released October 30th, 1998, was supposedly the very first financial success Carpenter had in about a decade since They Live, getting a reported budget of about $20 million and garnering only about $20 million back at the United States box office. Carpenter has said that the film was a much bigger hit overseas, and also garnered about $42 million back off of video rentals and sales, so if all that stuff is to be believed and it's all accurate, the film was a massive success. And the whole thing of how this film became what it was starts out with the 1990 novel from John Steakley called Vampires, with the S in vampires replaced with a $, because Jack Crow and his team actually work as Vampires Incorporated. And the kind of the interesting whole thing is, like, apparently, like the first act of the entire film, where you got the entire thing where they're clearing out the nest, and they go to the motel, and the master vampire shows up, there's a whole bunch of shit goes down. All this stuff is in the novel. But once you get past that point in the film, they go on a completely different track, have slight similarities, and like they still have the Father Adam character, but there's no Montoya, there's no Katrina. The entire plot moves off in a completely different direction and changes a lot of the different mythology and the whole thing. So it's like they took like the base kind of start off premise, then Carpenter and screenwriter John Jacoby, who had done screenwriting on Life Force and Arachnophobia and Double Team, the terrible Jean-Claude Van Damme film with Dennis Rodman, and a couple other things, like, yeah, little up and down type of things in the B-movie realm there for a long period of time. But him and Carpenter kind of worked on this entire idea. It's like, he read the novel, he read the original scripts that he kind of got presented to him, and it's like, yeah, there's something here I can do with it, but I want to kind of move it in a little bit of a different direction, either tonally or just the entire story in a certain way, just kind of shift it off to a different direction in a certain way. So a lot of people who are kind of like familiar with the novel going into the film is like, for the first like 20 minutes of the film, it's like, oh shit, this is basically the entire novel, and we're seeing it almost directly translated here. Then couple of minutes go by and things start hitting with scene after scene. It's like, this isn't even the novel anymore. He just completely changed everything aside from a couple of character names and moved off in a different direction. So, kind of an odd type of thing with a lot of people in that regard. But with John Carpenter's Vampires, the entire film, you can see in a certain way how it kind of hit off in a certain degree, because here's the late 90s. We hadn't got a lot of stuff in the early to mid 90s getting off too harsh on like a real sort of like hard edge, gory type of horror film, and having this hit like shortly after Blade hit with Wesley Snipes, which also reinvigorated the entire like vampire genre, gave you real cool, slick, badass vampire hunter type of film. This hits off people who are hot on that film, probably kind of real interested to see that it's a John Carpenter film, even though a lot of the films that you've been producing in the 90s, quality up and down here and there, stuff like that, hadn't really gotten up on the big box office type of thing, but you could still sell John Carpenter when you had the right marketing, even though the trailer for the entire film is kind of really dated and not terribly good in retrospect. They did a lot of good things apparently, because the film did apparently make a good amount of money there and did get off on a bit of a mixed type of thing with critics, because the film is, one, very gory and violent, and also so much of the entire film is such a film that wouldn't play so well today in this environment, because the entire film is very profane, just spouting it off like it's a bodily function, and how they have the character of Montoya and Jack Crow kind of treat Katrina in certain ways, and it's very testosterone fuel type of film that doesn't have any time for political correctness, which might not be far from kind of John Carpenter's kind of base sort of feeling in a certain way, but it definitely amplifies it much further than he ever even touched on in any type of other films whatsoever, because it's such an interesting thing how a lot of the critics kind of had a strong aversion to it. They felt it was crude and misogynistic and all these different things, but a few critics kind of latched onto it in a certain way, especially Gene Siskel, of all people. Kind of like he was like super high on the whole film. He really thought it was a major return to form for John Carpenter. Did a fantastic job with it. Had a lot of praise for Jim Woods' character, his entire performance, the entire film. Pretty much get to the point of saying like he thought James Woods should have been nominated for an Oscar off of the performance he put into this film. So it's kind of an interesting kind of thing how it's been one of those films in the later part of John Carpenter's filmography that kind of has had a bit of an odd type of a reflection upon it. It's like it hasn't been regarded as a classic in a certain way, but it has certain elements about it that are very much of certain praise to give to it. But certain things that I feel like it does kind of lack in some places that I'll get into as we go along in the entire thing. But Carpenter does such a great job in this whole film, kind of mixing and blending those Western and horror elements in the entire thing, where you got all the kind of rugged, down-to-earth, kind of gritty type of action the entire film has, and just jacking that up in a certain way to make it much more than just a Western in a certain way. You just have that sort of like big action film set pieces in the entire film, but you have all that kind of creepy, haunted moods and atmospheres going in when you're creeping around and trying to sort out where the vampires are and hunting them around and stalking them in the darkness. It's got all those wonderful little moments where it's all lit and shot in such a great way to elicit that terror and the kind of pins and needles type of feeling you can get in those certain situations, but never forgets that he's trying to make that Western. That's always the thing that Carpenter was so interested in. Even back to like Assault on Precinct 13, he really wanted to make a Western, but it really wasn't something that would kind of sell at that point in time, so he kind of turned into much more of an urban warfare type of film. And you always had little things, especially like Snake Plissken. There's so much of like an old gunslinger type of outlaw character that he just put into a different setting, a different genre in a certain way, but it still had those sort of rough and tumble sort of loner outlaw type of feelings to them. It's such a great type of thing how they have the entire thing in this entire film kind of evolve from those sensibilities and having him very enthusiastic about wanting to kind of adapt into that genre while taking the horror stuff that he's so well known for, but still making a sort of Western film in that regard, where he just brings all those elements in to create such a interesting character in a certain way with Jack Crow and all these other little things. So you kind of blend the gunslinger outlaw with the kind of dark, grim type of vampire stuff. It's just like it moves and flows so well between the two of them. Nothing feels like it's battling against one another in terms of aesthetics or tones or stuff like that. It all feels very much like it fits all together in a certain way. It's such a great type of style here, where Carpenter worked again here with his cinematographer Gary Kibbe, who had worked with since Prince of Darkness. And I think Kibbe just evolved so much over the years working with Carpenter, where this is probably one of his best looking films in terms of Gary Kibbe's cinematography. It looks wonderful. There's such a painterly light throughout his entire film, how it just splashes little light and shadow here and there to just kind of give you such a wonderful little tapestry of all these different things going off and gleaming in different scenes here and there. Give you a little sense of warmth with a certain sense of darkness and shadowy sensibilities, as well as like he does so many interesting subtle things with the lighting to create mood and atmosphere, and all these little things kind of creep up on you in a certain way. I like how he just uses so much of the slightness of light here in the darkness to create all these different qualities in the film to kind of get you a little bit creeped out here and there, stuff like that. But it captures so many wonderful, gorgeous desert vistas in the entire film. It just captures all those elements that Carpenter really didn't want to do too many like big kind of camera moves or stuff like that, move it around so much. You want to have kind of that old stoic sort of Western quality in the entire film, where just having this great strong image of all these different things, like all the close-ups going into Jack Crow at the beginning of the film, going back and forth between him and the nest. It just sells the entire visual storytelling of the movie in a certain way to really give you the sensibility of the entire blending of the genres type of thing. Like I said, it comes off very, very well in just how Gary Kibbe puts it all together and put all the action sequences together in such a wonderful type of fashion, where everything, as it should be, is a wide shot. Nothing comes in too close and crowds the frame and lose geography. He's always very conscious of how he wants to get that 2:3:5 cinemascope frame covering the action entire film. It's all put together flawlessly. The cinematography is just absolutely wonderful. The lighting, like I said, beautiful type of stuff. I think Kibbe just outdid himself, and apparently, from Carpenter's own words, he was on the shortlist for an Oscar nomination, but it never actually happened. So that'd be kind of an interesting thing if that actually did happen, because it is a gorgeous looking film, and I definitely say it definitely is worthwhile being one of the best looking Carpenter films ever put together. And the entire production of the film took place in New Mexico in this very oppressive heat, where you got like Thomas Ian Griffith as Valak. He's wearing these big heavy black outfit, and people wearing leather jackets and all these different things. Everyone's kind of dying out in the heat and everything, but as things were at the time, John Carpenter was producing the entire film with his wife Sandy King at Storm King Productions, and really moving this whole thing along. And with the entire casting process here, they were looking for very particular type of actors, and there's a lot of talk online in trivia sections about who might have been considered for this and who might have almost did this here and there, but without more corroboration, I'm kind of not entirely certain to really discuss that type of stuff. But what they really wanted for Jack Crow was not the usual sort of big muscle-bound type of action guy or something like that. They wanted someone who was a good, strong, dramatic actor, but had a sort of rugged, sort of lean type of physique in a certain way. And James Woods had never been like an action type of guy. He always been maybe like almost upper supporting role or something like that here and there, or maybe have a few leading roles, but they're not really action-oriented or stuff like that. But they gravitated towards him so much because he did bring forth that attitude. And Jack Crow is just a hardcore motherfucker. This guy just has this attitude where he doesn't give a shit about anyone's feelings. He's very abusive towards people, and he's a guy who's just so vehemently dead set about getting this guy, getting Valak, finding out this master vampire, the most powerful thing they've ever come across, slaughtered his entire team. He wants that revenge. He wants to get at this guy and rip him apart, and so nothing gets in his way. And I like to see that sort of track the characters on the whole film. Like, even though after they clear out the nest and he's kind of thinking about the master vampire, and they go back to the motel, and he's still kind of caging around in his head in a certain way. It's like there's just something just nagging at him the entire thing. Nothing seems right. He's waiting for the other shoe to drop, and when it does, it's a bloodbath. And so it's just an interesting type of thing, how he's such a very hardened character in such a way that's like he has almost a detestable reaction to just vampires in general. They're as Carpenter was kind of approaching it, they're like an infestation, like rats. They're just like all this horrible type of infestation across the entire planet in a certain way, and he's just here to exterminate every single last one of them because of his backstory, that his father got turned and didn't tell him and didn't tell his mother and anything like that, and then he himself had to kill his own father. So you can see where the attitude of the character comes from. It's built into that backstory and how he got raised by the Catholic Church to be the master vampire hunter and all this type of stuff. So you can see that trajectory to where he is now, to understand his attitude, where he goes and why he does this, and how he's just like, all your bullshit about trying to cover up little things and trying to hide little secrets here and there ain't fucking having any of it. How he starts ripping on Father Adam later on in the film. Nothing's going to get in this guy's way. He's not going to be courteous or polite, or he's not going to try and negotiate anything. If you're in his way, he's going to rip you apart until he gets what he wants and gets to where he needs to go to take care of business. So I like that sort of attitude of the character. It's very much a straight-up jackass. He's a fucking asshole. Jack Crow's a goddamn fucking piece of shit, but he's still enough of an anti-hero in a certain way to know that, yeah, this guy's doing this for all the right reasons, even if you might not agree with how he handles the situation. He is still technically the protagonist of the entire film. He's still the hero of the film. He just doesn't fit in that regular archetype of one. So it's such an interesting way of like making such an abrasive, attitudinal character like that, but still finding the cogs that make him sort of relatable to a degree. He always has these little moments later on in the film as you get more bonding between him and Father Adam and a few other things here and there. You can start seeing those bonds kind of build up and have a little bit more of an emotional attachment to all these guys between him and Montoya, how they're having a little bit of a sideways type of thing going on as Montoya is starting to turn and Jack Crow's not aware of it. All these little sort of conflicts kind of breed up, but there's still that brotherhood to build these characters up and still keep an attachment to them in a certain sense of humanity regardless of anything else. So it's a very well put together type of thing that, again, had an aversion towards a lot of people who watched the film back at the time and were critics and such and speaking their minds about how they didn't really appreciate the sort of vulgarity of the entire film. But I still think they put together a very interesting, compelling, and very intense character here, because James Woods, whether people think about his sort of stances these days and his sort of way he puts himself out there these days, still an incredible actor regardless of all that type of stuff, and he does a fantastic job in this film. And he was very appreciable the entire process of the entire film, because apparently he had like a chat with John Travolta at a certain point in time, saying like, actors are always trying to compete with one another, trying to get up on one another in a certain way to kind of have that, try to work against each other. And it was like, he went into this film instead, it was like, let's try to work together to try to make the best out of these situations. Instead of trying to one-up each other every time we step on screen, let's try to work together to try to make this whole thing. So it worked out as a much better, positive experience for him, working with Daniel Baldwin and Tim Guinee and all these different people in the entire film to really kind of make a much bigger, better rapport. So it's a much more pleasant experience for everyone working together. And most of the people on the film did have a positive experience. We get into a bit of a supporting role here is actually Cary Hiroyuki Tagawa. Many people know from like Showdown Little Tokyo and Mortal Kombat. Has a very minor role in the film that I'm not sure exactly what it was that brought him into the film, that there maybe if there was something more in the script than what ended up in the film, because he had a very, very bad experience in the entire film and having a very strong conflict with John Carpenter, swearing off he would never work with him ever again, because apparently he kept coming up to Carpenter all the time, having ideas for his character and different things to do in certain scenes, and Carpenter kept shutting him down time after time after time. Where in the film he has like maybe 2 lines of dialogue in the first 20 minutes and then he's dead. So I'm not entirely certain what Tagawa had when he walked into the film, as seeing what maybe there was something more on the page in a certain way. I'm not sure without seeing an original screenplay draft. But he went on the film expecting a much larger role and ended up getting a much smaller role in a certain way. So I'm not exactly sure how that went down, but he did swear off all this type of stuff in like a 2002 article with Starlog magazine. So he seemed to be the only main outcry of anyone having a bad experience, because all the things I've seen about this thing, everyone had a wonderful time of it. Even Daniel Baldwin, who said had some problems here and there, a couple of demons that he's kind of worked with. Carpenter said he came to work, he got his job done, he didn't have any problems on the set, he had kept himself straight, and worked and did his job very, very well. He had a very pleasant experience working with him, he didn't have any problems with him, and I think Baldwin does a good job in the whole film. It's maybe not the most standout type of thing, but I think what you have to do with the Montoya character, where he is a bit of another guy who's kind of a jackass, where he has to deal with Katrina here, the girl that has been bitten by Valak and she's turning, and they have to kind of use the sort of building psychic link between her and Valak to their advantage, but he has to have this sort of very turbulent relationship with her where she wants to not have any part of this, and he's got to have to deal with that, and they have so much conflict between the two of them where he has to be a bit of a real fucking jackass in this entire situation, smacking her around and all these different things where she bites him and all these different things, and it's a very interesting sort of relationship between the two characters where he has to be sort of just a hard-up bastard in a certain way, but also has certain moments where he does show a sense of humanity and compassion and care for, but it bounces back and forth through the entire film depending on how she's reacting to her own situation. So it's a very interesting type of thing, how he has to play that back and forth and not sort of betray one end of the spectrum to another. So it's a very interesting thing to see how Montoya does sort of deteriorate as the entire film goes on, but still maintains, again, that brotherhood with Crow, and still backs him up in the entire situation, never betrays him, and so he's always playing a bit of a line there between Jack Crow and Katrina there. So very interesting type of thing, how he has to deal with that, and he does a very, very good job of it as well. I think he does a solid performance the entire film. And Sheryl Lee, who many people know from Twin Peaks, is just a tour de force actress. She is a very intense, emotional type of actress, and she shows that so much. When she starts getting the visions as Katrina, she's just locked into an incredible zone there that just, like, it's so compelling, so captivating. How she pulls these moments out in the entire film. It just, again, the intensity, what she puts herself through, just the terror that she gets when she starts seeing Valak slashing people up and cutting their throats out and stuff like that. It's horrible. It's horrible stuff that she's having to bear witness to, and she sells that with such visceral sensibilities. Fantastic type of stuff, and just like, it's such an interesting thing. Again, she starts out just as a regular prostitute, and she's very alluring, very seductive and sexy, but she gets all these different things to play. She is a full-rounded actress in this film. They do make full use of what she has to offer here in all the different ways. Just like the terror she goes through and all these different things she has to deal with when she's starting to fall apart and stuff like that, and starting to turn in a certain way and gets up to being a full vampire, all these different things. It's a wonderful, fantastic performance. She does deliver absolutely 100% across the board with this role and everything else I've ever seen from her. She's incredible. And such an interesting thing that we've got the fantastic Thomas Ian Griffith in this entire film. I love this guy. Obviously, we got Terry Silver from Karate Kid Part 3. He's apparently making a comeback in the Cobra Kai series. And we also got him a couple nice sort of action roles in like the mid-90s. Had the really good Excessive Force that I reviewed several years ago. A couple direct-to-video things I think still showed a lot of quality from him. Just like, he never had a very strong series of fantastic hits to really cement him. But he does an incredible job here as well as Valak. Being this 6'4" type of guy, he's got all this physicality with knowing martial arts and be able to work with the physicality of the character and all these different things. He's awesome in this film. I just love so much that he knows how to work the imposing intimidation of his physical stature so much. The first moment you see him on screen, he's absolutely terrifying, and he's not really doing anything yet. Just seeing the imposing look of course, the dress and the makeup help with that, but his performance, how he carries himself on screen and presents himself and delivers the lines that he has in the entire film, it's chilling type of stuff, just like I absolutely love. It's like he's not even recognizable towards any other role I've ever seen him in. His entire, like, almost transformative performance, he just puts on an entirely different persona, different demeanor, different way of speaking in a certain way. He's so very richly in the entire thing, and he had an absolute blast on this entire film. He had an absolutely wonderful time working with everyone, John Carpenter, and Carpenter really didn't have him kind of intermingle or even rehearse with the other actors. He wanted to have them a little bit separated so he'd have that sort of natural sort of impact on everyone else on the set, which is a really nice type of thing to see, that they kind of make sure that they had a little bit of this sort of realistic sort of disconnect between them, a sort of disparity in a certain way, to see that they could have a little bit of a clash in there between the different characters and have them work in a little bit of a different style from one another. Griffith, I think, is fantastic in this whole thing. He just puts all the pieces together that create a really strong, scary type of villain. It really does, man. And getting Tim Guinee in this whole thing as Father Adam was a really nice thing. Another guy who was actually in Blade. If you kind of remember, he was Dr. Karen's sort of friend in the ER, stuff like that. And he gets turned into kind of mingled up monster towards the end of the film. So it's kind of a nice type of thing. You got to be into the best vampire films of the late 90s there, but he does a really great job. I think he's one of the best actors in the entire film because he gets to play a real strong arc. He starts out as the sort of innocent, sort of like untested young priest in the entire film. And such an interesting way of how he has to get kind of broken in by Jack Crow and all these different things, and he has to struggle with his entire sort of sense of secrecy about everything that he's been sworn to uphold with the Vatican and the Catholic Church and everything like that, and kind of move himself towards being part of the team, being within the confidence of Jack Crow and all this type of stuff, and building himself up towards the point where he is part of the Slayers and all these different things. So I like so much how that builds and how it turns, and how he plays those moments where he finally has to explain the entire reason what Valak's actually doing here to get the Black Cross of Bergier to transform himself from just a regular vampire into one that can walk in the daylight. So it's an interesting type of thing, how you see that. And he's just a wonderful goddamn performance. Just being able to show that subtlety and the nuance of the struggle he has, and building himself up to being a much more action-centric character, and having sort of building a backbone, a certain strength about what he believes and what he's going to do in certain situations. It's fantastic. He's a fantastic actor in this entire thing. And apparently he had worked with Sheryl Lee before on another project, but I think he's fantastic in the whole thing. And of course, as the original father in the entire film, the original padre they have in the entire team, Father Giovanni, portrayed by the fantastic Gregory Sierra, who was on the old show Barney Miller from the 70s into 80s. Wonderful show there, and it was actually the original lieutenant on Miami Vice before they brought in Edward James Owens as Lieutenant Mark Castillo. Sierra is a fantastic actor, and he brings some really nice scenes with the short time he's on screen here. Just like how he has a sort of nice reaction to everything. It's like he's with all these guys who have no qualms about slaying vampires and binge drinking and having crude humor, stuff like that. So he's always got this sort of nice sort of tempered reaction to everything like that, and kind of like, yeah, okay, I got to roll with it in a certain way. I got to kind of go along with it because I know these guys are doing the right thing, but he's not too thrilled about it. Then he gets all drunk and everything like that, and talking with Crow and everything. Wonderful actor. They really gave him some nice beats in the entire thing to make it really worth his while and anything like that. So I love Sierra. He's an excellent type of thing in this whole film. And of course, you had the very talented Maximilian Schell here, who's had a very storied career and puts in a really classy performance as Cardinal Alva, but feels so much like they don't really do enough with the character, because you got the whole setup scene between him, Jack Crow, and Father Adam early on the film. But then he's completely absent until you have the plot twist where he's in on it with Valak at the end of the film. There's nothing in between there to kind of develop him to a certain degree to make him much more of either more of a cog in the story, or just have something more there to kind of build it towards being something that'd be involved with that aspect of the story here. So they don't play enough with the entire thing of who ratted us out and who kind of informed on us to the vampires and stuff like that to let them know that we were coming and stuff like that. Someone was setting them up. Crow knows this, but they never really get to the point of it until that point where Alba kind of turns on them, and shows that he's in with Valak and stuff like this. So it's a plot element and a character situation that I don't feel like gets the proper development in the film and gets solidified well enough to have the payoff have enough setup to be impactful as much as it possibly could have been. But Schell's performance is very, very good in the whole film. He brings forth what he has to with what he's given. No blemish on him and what he does in the film. The entire cast is solid. John Carpenter really has a miscast role in most of his films. He's very good at putting together solid actors, very good characters, and wrapping them all up in a very good, solid package as an ensemble piece. And this really does hit the mark completely. And of course, one of the strongest and most reliable things about any John Carpenter film is getting a great score for it. And this thing is absolutely no exception whatsoever, because he had two of the best sort of blues guys involved with this thing. Steve Cropper and Donald Duck Dunn. These guys have played with almost every major R&B and blues act for decades before this. Most notably for film fans, they're part of the Blues Brothers band. These guys were the real deal, and they were such like storied, seasoned type of guys, and they came in with Carpenter to make such a great sort of Texas hard rock blues score, just like the hard edge guitar riffs and all the type of stuff, the main Slayer theme and all the other things, where it's still blending the genres together. You're still getting the hard edge western type of stuff in so many different places here, but you still get the sort of haunting ambiance of the horror stuff leaking in there with the synthesizers and stuff like that. And it's absolutely fantastic. I just absolutely love listening to it from beginning to end. Just gives you such a great vibe off it. They did a fantastic job on this whole thing. And in that little song there, teaser from the band Stone, not too many things documented about them, but the main guy behind it was apparently a very sort of accomplished blues guy to his own credit and stuff like that. So wonderful stuff on the music end of this whole film. And of course, the makeup effects in our film were handled by K&B Effects, the best guys in the field who had been working with Carpenter for at least a couple of films now, especially on In the Mouth of Madness. These guys were the go-to, and absolutely the best things for John Carpenter to say about Greg Nicotero and his entire team. These guys deliver every single time. And they weren't really trying to like reinvent the vampire in any type of way. They're very much trying to go for a very straightforward approach that still fell into the entire idea of them being this sort of vermin, this sort of infestation type of thing, this kind of ratty type of thing. So they kept it very straightforward, pale skin, a few little veins kind of here and there, but they fashioned the contact lenses for all the actors of the ones from The Exorcist. So they got this sort of like sickly green type of color to them, or anything like that. And also, when you get into Valak, it's a little bit more evolved to a certain degree. It's a little bit more elegant towards his style and everything like that. So they still maintain all the really creepy aspects, all the claws and the fangs and all these little things. They just put in such great detail to everything they put into this whole thing. And of course, when they start slashing and tearing people apart, it looks excellent. Just the whole thing with Mark Boone Jr. when he walks in and sees Valak, and Valak just slits him right up the center. It's a wonderful effect they did hold there with a little bit of puppetry involved with the whole thing. They're very particular how they wanted to have him sort of flop open to a certain degree. So they did a very particular type of job towards that. And of course, when they're dragging all the freaking vampires out in the sunlight, they had a very particular type of things. Like they'll drag the stunt person out, but then they'll cut to a different shot where they had a bit of a, something that has a little bit more of a puppetry to it when they had all this stuff kind of spark off with all the fire and stuff like that, and kind of burned almost like mercury in certain ways. So they did a great job with this thing. Of course, all the decapitations, all the exsanguinations, all these different things. Just seeing also the transformation of Katrina from human to much more of a vampire there. Wonderful stuff, how they gradually and subtly kind of move that along with their complexion, all these different little things that change over. All the blood effects, all the gore, where this is like probably the goriest film John Carpenter had made since The Thing. Because after that, I mean, he had some stuff that had a little bit of blood here and there, but nothing that went like full whole hog in the entire goddamn thing. And this film really made an impression on me back in '98 when I was like mainly just kind of familiar with just Halloween, which is just an atmospheric suspense film with almost no blood whatsoever. Then I walk into this thing, and there's blood gushing all over the goddamn place, and violence aplenty in the whole thing. So it was very much kind of a jarring type of thing. Though I knew I had a completely different spectrum of what John Carpenter was capable of. Came this thing with the best in the business, as I said, doing the effects work. These guys always deliver 100% every single time. But kind of addressing the overall tone and the approach the entire film has, especially compared to other stuff in Carpenter's filmography, does come off a little bit more mean-spirited because, of course, it's based mostly on a book and more of a screenwriter that Carpenter really hadn't worked with before. So it's a little bit of a different approach. And definitely has just a lot more, again, with all the profanity, all that type of stuff. The characterizations are a little bit more aggressive in their mentalities than what Carpenter typically utilized in most of his films. So it definitely does come off a little bit more of a harsher, more abrasive type of film. Just like it's much more in your face about everything it's doing. And there does kind of feel like there's a little bit less of a certain wit that Carpenter usually has in his films, where he can kind of play around a little bit with the ideas here and there, and have a little bit of a different dichotomy with the sense of humor in the entire film. Also, not every Carpenter film has like larger ideas, stuff like that, or big thematic elements, but most of them seem to kind of thread through. You have stuff like They Live. It has a lot of sort of socio-political type of stuff. In the Mouth of Madness has a lot of different, like, all the bigger sort of almost like Lovecraftian things and the ideas of perception of reality versus fiction, stuff like that. A lot of them have certain sensibilities and certain overarching themes to them that you can kind of feel like there's a bit of a larger sensibility about the entire film that Vampires really doesn't have. It's much more of a straightforward sort of action, horror, western type of thing. You know, the clear-cut motivations, the clear-cut things going on in the story. So there's not as much going on in that regard, and there's not as much of a bigger scope to it. Like I said, there's not a lot of like outside characters. Like when you're getting with the Catholic Church, it's basically like Father Giovanni and Father Adam and Maximilian Schell's character of Colonel Alba. So it's like there's not like a larger sensibility about the entire scope of the film where you're dealing with Valak, with this, the first vampire has been around for centuries and has this entire thing with the Catholic Church. And it's like, you don't get like a wider sense of implication about if he becomes able to walk in the daylight. All these other minions really can't do that themselves. They're still stuck in the dark at night and everything like that. So it just feels a little like you could have evolved the ideas a little bit, could have expanded the ideas a little bit to have a little bit of a wider scope to what it really means overall. That maybe if he becomes able to do that, he can pass it on to other vampires that he has under his control, stuff like that. There's certain things that feels a little constrained in the scope to a certain degree, and they did kind of play around a little bit with the ending of the film, because they felt originally that what they had on the screenplay wasn't quite enough, and so James Woods was working with John Carpenter in the whole scene there where him and Valk are having the showdown, stuff like that, and he kind of thought the idea is like, well, what if I knock down some of these slats over the top and the sunlight comes in and blows them up, stuff like that. So they went along with that idea, and that is a better idea than whatever they're trying to kind of improve upon, but I still feel like it's not as much of a cathartic sort of ending to a certain degree. The film really doesn't feel like it plays it up to like a major sense of peril, get that height of suspense and tension and danger and consequence, and then have a real cathartic sensibility that is like a definitive ending. So it's like, it just always felt a little lackluster how the film ended there, because you just have him knock down the whole thing and he burns up and blows up. And then you have all the stuff you have to deal with Montoya and Katrina and how Jack Crow's kind of going to deal with that situation along with Father Adam and stuff like that. Those character dynamics need to be resolved, and I do very much like how they go about it. Just feel like the entire thing with Valk just feels a little anticlimactic to me. It just feels like it needs a bigger payoff, something a little bit more, like I said, cathartic towards the sort of journey that Jack Crow has been on this entire time. So it's like, it feels just like you just lost a few elements that I think it would make it surpass into like a great film. I think it's a pretty damn good film to a certain degree. Obviously, like I said, certain tastes will be a little bit averted towards how you digest the sort of the profanities, the very gory violence, stuff like that, the very blunt force sort of sensibilities the film projects out into the screen, but it's got great performances. The effects are absolutely fantastic. The general story is very solid. I do very much like the general story of the whole film, despite the departures it makes from the source material. It's still a good story. It just felt like some places it could have been expanded a little bit to have a little more depth to the entire thing, and a little bit better payoff at the end of the film. A few little things tweaked here and there, but I think generally it just is a good, satisfying type of film that delivers greatly on action. Carpenter can cover action fantastically, handles horror like no one's business, and just does a really good job with the whole score, and the cinematography, like I said, is actually fantastic in the entire film. So I think John Carpenter's Vampires, not heralded as one of his best, because the 90s, a lot of people kind of view his stuff in the 90s as kind of faltering to a certain degree. He had such a great track record through the late 70s, throughout the 80s, stuff like that. The 90s stuff kind of felt like it was wavering here and there in how good the stuff was and maybe how committed Carpenter was to certain ideas and certain projects here and there. This one's like a little bit on the tail end, it a little tapers off, but it probably needs a little bit of reassessment for everyone. So if you haven't seen it in quite some time, I think it's worth checking out again. I definitely think that's worthwhile, especially the Screen Factory Blu-ray has some really nice interviews, good insights in the entire thing, really give you a little bit more depth into the entire process of how they made the film. And of course, they did have a franchise on this whole thing, because in 2002 they released John Carpenter Presents, because he's just a producer on this whole thing, Vampires Los Muertos, directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, who had done Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, he'd done Fright Night Part 2, he'd done the It miniseries, and so he came into this thing with John Bon Jovi starring in the entire film, and they go off on a bit of a different direction, because apparently the original idea from Carpenter and Sandy King was much more towards the end of Father Adam, Jack Crow. They go down to Mexico to kind of hunt Montoya and Katrina kind of becomes like the queen of the vampires down there, and Jack Crow dies to a certain degree throughout the entire journey there before they get into the actual story of the film. And so it's basically like Father Adam becomes like the soul slayer going after this whole thing, following as a direct sequel. This one goes off an entirely kind of a different direction. It's different characters, different setup, different storyline, following an entirely different path, but still feels like it is a sequel. I haven't watched it in 19 years, but at the time when I watched it, reading the little bit of reviews I kind of put out at the time, I thought it was decent. I thought it came off pretty alright. It wasn't bad. Tommy Lee Wallace is a very good director, and he gave a good thing. John Bon Jovi can put together a good performance. He can do that. He can throw it together and stuff like that. So I generally thought the entire film was pretty good. But then they kind of made this other film that is called Vampires the Turning, which basically is all set in like Asia, Japan or something like that. Has absolutely no connection whatsoever to the first two films. There's no John Carpenter involved. They're pretty much just like, they had the rights to the name Vampires and just kind of stuck it on this entire film. They're kind of like, maybe it's kind of a sequel here and there, but it really doesn't have anything to do with it. So I watched the trailer for it. It really had nothing to do with anything, so I didn't really put any more research in the entire goddamn movie. Whatever. If you've seen that one, go ahead and let me know anything about it, because it's just not much of anything to really talk about in terms of the relationship to the John Carpenter-involved films that preceded it. But guys, I just want to hear what you feel about this John Carpenter film, because obviously, like I said, it's been on that kind of weird tail end of things with Carpenter, where things were just not quite hitting on all cylinders. And so after this, you get like Ghosts of Mars, and things kind of fall for a long time, and he does some other things that probably weren't his passion projects or stuff like that, where he came back in, did The Ward and the stuff with the Masters of Horror series. So this was kind of the last one where I think he probably was maybe full bore into the entire process and was very much pleased with it after Escape from LA really kind of bombed at the box office to a large degree, and a lot of things got undercut with that in the post-production. That's why a lot of the CGI in that film is terrible, because they cut months of the post-production time from underneath the effects team. So he had a lot of bad things with that. So fortunately, he did have a good experience making this film with a lot of people who just worked with him very nicely. And I think it's really much worthwhile to assess it on your own and give me your own feedback on the film. So guys, thanks so much for checking things out. There's always the Patreon to contribute something every month to get a little early access to certain things, and get a little preview of what else is coming up on the channel here. So guys, thank you so much. Always, if you can comment, subscribe if you haven't, because that makes a major difference, along with sharing the links around anything that you enjoy here. If you share those links around, that allows other people to come into the fold here and we can all enjoy a much larger discourse about everything that goes on between the reviews, the retro video series, and the commentary tracks. Thank you so much, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.